Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in his presentation of the estimates of revenue expenditure, the Minister of Finance used various descriptions to describe the situation unleashed by the COVID-19 pandemic on the government and people of St. Lucia. He spoke of an unprecedented situation. He said the estimates are tabled against a background of grave uncertainty. He admitted COVID-19 will have a lasting impact on the economy of St. Lucia. And he exhorted, if, quote him directly, if ever there was a time to rally, now is the time, unquote. So, Mr. Speaker, without a doubt, we are in a crisis, an economic storm never possibly experienced since independence. Consider the indicators of this crisis, Mr. Speaker, some of which were mentioned by the Minister of Finance in his presentation yesterday. Significant increase in unemployment, especially in the tourism sector. There are figures of some 14,000 individuals being bandied around. Closure of ports of entry and departure. And in a more dramatic way, the likelihood of a dramatic decline in economic growth, possibly of a magnitude, the Minister of Finance says, between minus 10% and minus 18% of GDP. All of this was said yesterday, Speaker. Some 700 million in bonds due to be paid in or by September. And there is a rare likelihood that all the bonds may not be refinanced or rolled over. And then yesterday, again, unprecedented declines in revenue intake or generation. In fact, I think the Minister of Finance suggested that there was, in the first 2 months, some 60% decline in revenue. As a result of all of this, dramatic reduction of the incomes of businesses. And then there is a proposal to cut the emoluments of public sector workers, the magnitude of 35% to 75% with a proviso, Mr. Speaker, that any amount foregone will be paid in bonds. In effect, Mr. Speaker, public officers will be lending money to the government of St. Lucia. And in return for foregoing their salaries, lending this money to the government of St. Lucia, they would be issued bonds. Again, unquestionably, Mr. Speaker, this is truly unprecedented. Then a few days ago, we had this rather unusual act of generosity by the National Insurance Corporation, making available, the Minister of Finance says, some $33 million to $18 million free of cost to the government to pay the wages of displaced workers for a specified period. At the time the statement was made, it was unclear, understandably, Mr. Speaker, that the precise amount that would be utilized for that purpose is not available. Then, on the social front, we had the distribution of some 10,000 food packages to those in need. And I sincerely hope, Mr. Speaker, that at some point this House will receive a report as to how those food packages were distributed and in what amounts to what quantities to constituencies, because therefore South was in receipt of just over, I think, 225 or 30 food packages. Mr. Speaker, if we are in a crisis, and I've given you examples of the indicators of the crisis, itemized in large measure by the Minister of Finance, the question then becomes who should be at the center of the estimates of revenue and expenditure for 2020. As you may have heard before, shouldn't the estimates of revenue and expenditure be so designed, so structured that the people of St. Lucia in effect are placed at the center of the financial proposals and become the prime beneficiaries? Shouldn't these estimates tell us what arrangements are in place to increase our testing capabilities for the coronavirus? Will we be told whether we will ever be in a position to test the vast majority of the population? What in these estimates of revenue and expenditure address the pain, the plight, and the anguish of the people of St. Lucia? How do these estimates make a difference in their lives at this time? Now, Mr. Speaker, do not get me wrong. Of course, some help has been extended, has been forthcoming. After all, we were told, and I mentioned it earlier, contributors to the National Insurance Corporation will get partial unemployment relief, and we have in fact voted for a kind of unemployment insurance in effect. The homeless and those who roam our streets got a surprise of their lives, a Sunday meal. But then, Mr. Speaker, what about the huge army of unemployed persons? The elderly, the small businesses facing extinction, the minibus drivers, and the forlorn and the distressed. What is there in these estimates for them? But make no mistake about it, hunger and destitution will stalk this land. It may be for 3 months, or possibly 6 months, or possibly even more. Mr. Speaker, I know I will be accused of exaggeration, even dishonesty. That is okay, that's normal. But each and every one of us who is a parliamentary representative know the fair anxiety and destitution that exists in our communities, even though the full impact has not been unleashed. In my own constituency of Beaufort South, I continue to raise funds to provide those who are homeless and those who roam the streets with a meal every day of the week. I have no idea how long I will be able to continue this effort. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that the NIC gift of financial support should also be used wisely to benefit those who are not in gainful employment. The precise cost to the NIC is unknown, but the Minister of Finance says some 33 million to 80 million has been allocated for employment relief, albeit to those who have paid NIC contributions. On the assumption that the cost may be lower, let us say 50 to 60 million, I urge the government to allocate some 20 million to provide to those in want and need with, those in want and need with food vouchers for the next few weeks. We have to feed and look after our people, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that this occasion is an ideal occasion for people at least to be given vouchers to purchase basic items. Of course, Mr. Speaker, I maintain my position that this unusual and extraordinary gift by the National Insurance Corporation be reconsidered and treated as a soft loan to the government of St. Lucia on exceedingly generous terms, whether it's 1.5% or 2%. We have a duty, a responsibility to protect the integrity and viability of the National Insurance Corporation. But, Mr. Speaker, if we are in an unprecedented crisis for which these estimates of revenue and expenditure have been fashioned, then the government has a duty to make frank and full disclosure about the financial affairs of the country. It must put all its cards on the table. It must not put the opposition in search. We need to know all the financial resources available to the state so rational and reasonable decision-making could be made. So the Minister of Finance will tell us what is the total amount in the vaunted sinking fund. After all, it has been 4 years of accumulation. How much has been earned by the extra 150 tax on fuel? How much has been spent? And how much remains? What is the amount in the lockbox held by SLASPA from the travel taxes imposed on St. Lucians and visitors to the country? Has it been opened and for what? How much is held by T.O.R. King in his escrow account on behalf of the government and people of St. Lucia from the sale of our passports?
$0.
And is Invest St. Lucia holding any funds on behalf of the government of St. Lucia in overseas accounts from the sale of passports, and if so, how much?
$0.
Mr. Speaker, sadly, it looks like it's business as usual. If I did not know what was going on around the world and in St. Lucia, and I only looked at these budget estimates, I would think that COVID-19 is a myth. The tourism sector is booming or about to boom, and the revenue declines that the Minister for Finance spoke to are but a figment of his imagination. Only yesterday in his presentation, the Minister of Finance said the pandemic caused a 60% decline in revenue. The government has budgeted revenue which is approximately 70 million below the projected outturn for 2019-20. I invite you to look at page Roman numeral 3, Mr. Speaker. Yet the same government has told us that they anticipate revenue shortfalls of a minimum of EC 40 million per month for at least 3 months to July 2020. This is equivalent to EC $160 million. Against this anticipated decline, they have even asked public servants to consider a pay cut of approximately 35 to 60%, which for my part I treat as a loan. 75%. This raises two questions. Despite the economic conditions globally, did the government of St. Lucia deliberately overestimate its likely revenue for fiscal year 2020-2021 to justify taking on major projects which at this time can be delayed? Or two, is the government of St. Lucia deliberately saying to public servants that revenue will be lower than anticipated to lure them into taking a pay cut so that the government can have the fiscal space to take on other projects, which are, Mr. Speaker, of greater priority than the welfare of public servants? Mr. Speaker, it's one or the other, and the answer to either of these questions does not cast the government in a positive light. Still on revenue, Mr. Speaker. The government has indicated that capital revenue will likely be around 10.82 million, a little more than 3 times the amount for fiscal 2019-2020. Again, I ask you to see page Roman numeral 4 of the estimates, Mr. Speaker. This leads me to ask what prized national asset belonging to the people of St. Lucia will this government part with this year to yield this amount, this rather unusual amount? Mr. Speaker, the more things change, the more they remain the same. We are in a global pandemic. Tourism is likely to contract significantly. We have no idea when the global economy will likely reopen, and even when it reopens, some experts are predicting a second wave of COVID-19 during the winter months, our peak tourist period. Supply chains are being interrupted, and economists have forecasted the deepest recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Amid all of this, we in St. Lucia have made no meaningful adjustments to our budget. Amazingly, in the coming year, Mr. Speaker, the government aims to spend approximately $38 million more than it did in fiscal year 2019-2020. Again, I invite you to look at Roman numeral 4. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that these estimates do not consider the environment in which we currently live. We are in Wonderland. How can we be asking public officers to suffer a pay cut while proposing to increase their numbers in the public service? This is simply inconsistent. The government proposes to increase the number of staff at the permanent mission in New York. This is a time when many St. Lucians are calling to reduce the number of foreign missions to ease the burden on the public purse. The government also proposes to increase the number of staff in the office of the Governor General. Why at this time? All this expenditure despite all the talk of revenue shortages and preserving cash flow. Mr. Speaker, I notice though that our capital expenditure is budgeted to increase some $127 million over the projected expenditure for 2019-2020. Now, what, pray tell, will the government be spending all this money on? Mr. Speaker, at page 4 of the estimates, I note an item of expenditure denoted as other. May I ask what constitutes other? After all, $6 million of taxpayer dollars in these times is no small amount. The government proposes to spend $249 million on buildings and improvements and about $66 million on plant, machinery, and equipment. Again, Mr. Speaker, I invite you to look at the summary, Roman numeral 4 in the estimates. Curiously, the expenditure on buildings and improvements in 2020 increases by some $51.5 million and plant and machinery and equipment by some $31.3 million. In these times, why? Why? Can the people of St. Lucia have more details on what type of plant and machinery that the government of St. Lucia intends to procure? Is it more motor vehicles, farm equipment, or is it incinerators? While we're on the subject, do we have the capacity to spend $249 million on plant and improvement? Does the capacity lie in the Ministry of Infrastructure, Ministry of Economic Affairs, or both, or elsewhere? I'm just seeking answers, Mr. Speaker. I note that the Department of Economic Development plans to spend some $44 million on construction of the St. Jude's Hospital, a matter that the leader of the opposition has addressed. And I will only re-emphasize. $44 million on a facility that was nearing completion some 4 years ago. $44 million when 2 buildings are alleged to have been demolished. And $44 million in an environment where the government says it's not sure whether investors will roll over their bonds. In fiscal year 2019-20, according to the Social and Economic Review at page 52, the government spent $31.8 million on the St. Jude project. Add this to the proposed $44 million for 2021, take it to a total of $85.8 million. Mr. Speaker, this sum represents approximately 80% of the total amount that had been expended on St. Jude at June 2016. I await patiently for the outcome in terms of total expenditure by this administration. Talking about bonds, Mr. Speaker, the budget presented has a net financing requirement of $559 million. The government anticipates that they will raise, Mr. Speaker, approximately $267 million on the regional bond markets. the same market which the Minister for Finance has been indicating that may not have the necessary demand to roll over existing bonds. Now, if we are likely to have difficulty rolling over the existing bonds and bills, will the market take up these new instruments that will likely be floated? I now turn, Mr. Speaker, to a sensitive issue, sensitive subject, growth performance. The Economic and Social Review at page 9 says that the economy of St. Lucia grew by 1.7% in 2019. Decelerated growth since 2017. This was based on growth in stay-over arrivals of 4.7% and 8.6% in value added. Mr. Speaker, I need some clarification on the constant rebasing of GDP in St. Lucia. Only in 2016, the Statistics Department engaged in a rebasing exercise, and 3 years later, in 2019, they are back at it again. I don't even want to hear the story right now, just the explanation. One cannot help but wonder what about the objective of this rebasing activity? Is it to inflate the base and ensure that debt to GDP ratio does not increase even with the deteriorating fiscal conditions? Whatever the answer, this rebasing activity is at best strange. This leads me to the fiscal performance, Mr. Speaker. At page 11, paragraph 2 of the Economic and Social Review, the following appears. Preliminary data indicates that public finances deteriorated in fiscal year 2019-2020. The central government recorded a larger deficit of 193.8 million, 3.5% of GDP. I note, Mr. Speaker, that 3.5% deficit is 3.5% of the rebased, now higher, larger base GDP. I asked the Minister of Finance to update this House on what would have been the size of the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP had this rebasing exercise not taken place. If you want to evaluate your economy, then allow the House to see the statistics on both sides of the economic pole. It really leads me to wonder about the exact motive behind rebasing the GDP. Mr. Speaker, I want to address the analysis of debt presented by the Minister of Finance and as presented and supported by the Social and Economic Review. I must say, I am impressed with the craftiness and political savvy of those who are responsible for the Social and Economic Review. Mr. Speaker, consider the following statement at page 68 of the Social and Economic Review. Quote, during the last 5 years, 2015 to 19, public debt accumulation has been growing at an annual average rate of 3.6%, below the rate of 8.4% for the preceding 5 years, 2010-2014, unquote. Mr. Speaker, at a minimum, this statement is provoking and obviously suggests poor management of the fiscal accounts of the government of St. Lucia, which of course has been the argument of the government of St. Lucia over the period of governance by the Labour Party administration 2011-2016. Why would the Ministry of Finance staff, who are supposed to be independent public officials, choose to produce an analysis in this manner? I have no idea. Mr. Speaker, we have to delve in the truth hurts, sir. Mr. Speaker, we have to delve in this matter because debt is a big issue in these estimates. When the UWP left office in December 2011, the fiscal deficit for that fiscal year stood at approximately 9 to 10% of GDP, or approximately $306 million. Due to rebasing of the GDP, This figure now stands at 5% as per figure 21 at page 62 of the Social and Economic Review. Figure 21, Mr. Speaker. This record deficit at the time represents money that the government of St. Lucia did not have and would have had to borrow. The implication of this, Mr. Speaker, is that this astronomical deficit led to a substantial increase in debt stock as it had to be financed. It is an arithmetic fact that higher debt leads to higher debt service in subsequent years. And unless the fiscal fundamentals are addressed, this will lead to higher deficits, thus creating a vicious debt spiral. That higher growth rate in debt was due to the reckless expenditure of the prior UWP administration of 2006 to 2011, blamed largely on the increases of wages in the public sector. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, as the debt stock increases, a fixed increase in debt would be reflected as a smaller percentage increase. Mr. Speaker, this is basic arithmetic that I am sure does not escape the competent public officials who produce a social and economic review. The fact remains that the former Labour government conquered the spiral of fiscal deficits which it inherited. That is why, on assuming office, they found a fiscal deficit just over 3% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, I note that the Minister of Finance suggests that the debt to GDP ratio for 2019 stands at 59.6%. He gloats that the opposition had it all wrong, moving in the wrong direction. He is supported by the Economic and Social Review at page 68, Mr. Speaker. I am curious about what the debt to GDP ratio would have been had the GDP not been rebased. I have learned to question and to compute some of those figures on my own, Mr. Speaker. Now, based on the projected GDP for 2019, from the old methodology, my estimate is that the debt to GDP ratio would have been around 67.8%. The situation was salvaged by another round of rebasing. Mr. Speaker, we can rebase all we want, but the truth still stands. The United Workers' Party government has engaged in reckless fiscal management of the country. Mr. Speaker, perhaps unwittingly, the staff of the Ministry of Finance provide very clear evidence of the sound fiscal management of the economy by the Labour administration. I say unwittingly. I draw your attention again to figure 21 at the top of page 62. That graph, Mr. Speaker, sends a very powerful message. It demonstrates that with every successive year in government, the St. Lucia Labour Party was able to reduce the deficit. The deficit was reduced from over 10% of GDP to a little over 3% of GDP. With the new GDP numbers, it goes from over 7% to about 2.5%. So, Mr. Speaker, that graph, figure 21, tells a story, not Kennedy Anthony. Very clear pattern of fiscal correction, which ensured after 2011-2012, under Labour is being reversed. Mr. Speaker, figure 21 would have been even more startling if the GDP was not rebased, more telling evidence of the motive of and for the rebasing exercise. Mr. Speaker, we have urged that the government reprioritize away from unnecessary capital expenditure and focus on the needs of the people of St. Lucia. Look after the people of St. Lucia. The message of the opposition is simple. Put the people of St. Lucia at the heart, the center of these estimates. One place to start looking is the expenditure for consultancies. This government has a strange fetish for consultancies. Just look at some of the allocations. RCIP attracts a consultancy of $226,041. Page 573. Attorney General's Chambers, $313,900, page 575. Ministry of Tourism, $414,553, see page 593. Ministry of Housing, Urban Development and Telecommunications, $739,508, look at page 597. Department of Infrastructure, Ports and Energy, $5,146,172. Look at page 587. Ministry of Equity, Social Justice, Local Government and Empowerment, $3,801,619. Page 599. Department of Education, Innovation and Gender Relations, $227,976. Look at page 601. Department of Health and Wellness, $2,080,985. Page 603. Department of Sustainable Development, $1,442,034. Page 607. Department of Economic Development, Transport and Civil Aviation, $490,535, page 609. Curiously, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Youth and Sports receives an allocation of $11,064,600 for infrastructural development. But no amount is shown for consulting services and commissions. Page 605. I wonder why. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has announced to this country that reconstruction of the Hiwanura International Airport is a matter that is not up to debate. This is despite his utterances regarding the fiscal quagmire that exists, poor cash flow, and the inevitable economic storm. And Mr. Speaker, life is so cruel. Sometimes ordinary people speak of karma. Day in, day out, this opposition pointed out to the government the fragility of the tourism sector, the real possibility that sometime in the future we may have a cataclysmic event of unknown proportion, and this could put into severe jeopardy the financing arrangements for that airport, and perhaps another approach should be taken. All of this on deaf ears. One has to wonder, therefore, what is so urgent about this airport project. And of course, the Fort South constituency is the home of this project. Now, those who believe that this airport project will work magic are in for a very rude awakening. Waves and waves of investment by this government in Beaufort has never changed the loyalty, the passion, and the commitment of the people of Beaufort. Never. And they understand full well when attempts are being made to influence and bribe them. But, Mr. Speaker, I have searched all over these estimates for evidence of this project, all to no avail. So, the fiction remains. This is a SLASPA project, so the financing burden remains that of SLASPA, not to be shown on our books, except, of course, under the section dealing with guaranteed debts. Yet, it is this Parliament that guarantees the loans. And when it is this Parliament that guarantees the loans, then it has to be placed on the books. You know, Mr. Speaker, we cannot manage an economy by fictions, statistically or otherwise. Mr. Speaker, what can I say about my constituency, Beaufort South? that has had to endure the pains it has had in the last few years. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition said it well. Not one single project on the constituency development program has been made available to Vieux-Fort South. The roads of Vieux-Fort South remained littered with potholes. The community infrastructure built in La Richousse, Docamel, and these areas is falling apart. No help, no assistance from the Ministry of Infrastructure. Day in, day out, the staff of the Ministry of Infrastructure say to me that no allocation is made to Vieux-Fort to attend to the needs of the community. But there's resilience. People of Vieux-Fort South understand why this is happening to them and the reasons for this. And very soon, they will be able to pronounce their judgment on these matters. Mr. Speaker, when all is said and done, the estimates of revenue and expenditure before us should be rejected, scrapped, and repudiated. The government should wheel and come again. Come with estimates of revenue and expenditure that addresses the plight, the fears, the needs, and anxieties of our citizens in these perilous times. It is my view, Mr. Speaker, that it would certainly have been more helpful if the government had said that we need to obey the Constitution, introduce or lay the estimates of revenue and expenditure before the House, get approval for expenditure. But the people of St. Lucia should expect, in the circumstances, a supplementary budget to deal with the unexpected events that will surely arise. My colleagues, the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Castries South may well be right that these estimates were prepared with an eye to the forthcoming general elections. They may well be right. But one individual in my constituency of Vieux-Fort South, who was a strong supporter of the United Workers' Party of Flabo, also concluded that these estimates are clearly meant to finance an election budget. Mr. Speaker, that person authorized me to say as follows, quote, "I have now made my way home to where I once belonged, the St. Lucia Labour Party." Mr. Speaker, that individual awaits the United Workers' Party in the constituency of Vieux-Fort South. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.